Melinda Cash was the kind of person who disappeared into backgrounds. At 28, she had worked in the basement archives of the Capitol Intelligence Subcommittee staff wing for 3 years, methodically cross-referencing old transcripts, flagging duplicate entries, and refiling years of bureaucratic clutter that no one else wanted to touch. Her job wasn't glamorous, but she had developed a habit that would change everything. She listened. One ordinary afternoon, while organizing classified correspondence files, she overheard 2 staffers joking about a ghost drive, a pocket-sized USB that officially didn't exist. They laughed about it casually, but Melinda didn't laugh. She noted the name they mentioned, W Staff Line. Going back through older entries, tracing emails where that code name appeared in metadata, she found they weren't frequent, barely more than 4 instances. But they all pointed to one inbox, Patel's. That was the thread she tugged, and when she did, the whole corrupt sleeve came apart. Months of quiet investigation led her to compile evidence of a dirty deal between Tim Scott and Patel that would destroy careers. Now, as Scott prepared to attack Jasmine Crockett in a congressional hearing, he had no idea that the files in Jasmine's possession would bring his own downfall. The House Intelligence Committee hearing room buzzed with anticipation on that Tuesday morning in March. The mahogany-paneled chamber, with its curved rows of leather chairs and imposing gallery, had witnessed countless political battles, but today felt different. The air crackled with intention that veteran Capitol reporters recognized as the prelude to something significant. Representative Jasmine Crockett sat in the second row of the Democratic side, her navy blazer crisp, her expression calm but alert. She had arrived early, as was her habit, spending the morning reviewing her notes and the materials that had arrived anonymously at her Dallas district office just 4 days earlier. The manila envelope had contained documents so explosive that she had immediately called her legal team to verify their authenticity. Across the aisle, Senator Tim Scott commanded attention in his perfectly tailored charcoal suit. At 58, Scott carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never lost a major political battle. As the Republican Party's most prominent black voice and a rumored presidential contender, he had come to this hearing with a specific mission: to discredit the rising star from Texas who had been making waves with her pointed questions about defense contracting irregularities. Scott's staff had briefed him extensively on Crockett, 2-term Congresswoman, former prosecutor, social media savvy, but relatively inexperienced in high-stakes congressional warfare. His communications director had even suggested that challenging her publicly would demonstrate Scott's ability to handle disruptive elements within the Democratic Party, a skill that would serve him well in a presidential campaign. What Scott didn't know was that Melinda Cash had spent her weekend making copies of everything she had discovered, placing them in unmarked envelopes and walking into Crockett's district office during her day off. All she had said to the receptionist was, "Give this to her. No one else." Committee Chairman Robert DuPont called the session to order at precisely 10 a.m. The hearing was supposed to focus on routine oversight of intelligence operations, but Scott had requested time for questions regarding the qualifications and judgment of certain committee members. Everyone in the room knew he meant Crockett. DuPont announced, "The chair recognizes Senator Scott for 5 minutes." Scott rose slowly, adjusting his tie with practiced precision. He had perfected this routine over years of Senate hearings: the deliberate pause, the serious expression, the tone that suggested he was about to address matters of grave national importance. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to begin by expressing my deep concern about the direction this committee has taken under the influence of certain members who seem to prioritize political theater over serious governance." He turned to face Crockett directly, his voice taking on a condescending edge that made several Democrats in the room shift uncomfortably. "Representative Crockett, your recent statements about defense contractors have been reckless and inflammatory. You've made serious accusations without proper evidence, and frankly, I question whether someone with your limited experience in national security matters should be making such claims." The room went silent. Scott had just publicly challenged not only Crockett's competence, but her right to participate in committee business. It was a calculated insult designed to provoke either an emotional response or embarrassed silence, both of which would serve Scott's purposes. Crockett leaned forward slightly toward her microphone, her voice steady and clear. "Senator Scott, I appreciate your concern about evidence-based governance. It's interesting that you bring up the importance of proper documentation, because I have some questions about your own relationship with the contractors you seem so eager to defend." Scott's smile faltered, almost imperceptibly. This wasn't the response he had expected. Crockett was supposed to be defensive, not going on the offensive. "What exactly are you suggesting, Representative?" Scott asked, his tone still confident but with a slight edge. Crockett opened the folder that had been sitting closed in front of her throughout the morning. "I'm suggesting that before we discuss my qualifications, we should examine yours. Specifically, your financial relationships with Meridian Defense Systems and your role in their recent no-bid contract acquisitions." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Meridian Defense was one of the largest military contractors in the country, and any suggestion of impropriety involving a sitting senator would be front-page news. Scott straightened in his chair. "Representative Crockett, I have never had any inappropriate relationship with defense contractors. My voting record on defense spending is a matter of public record and—" "I'm not finished," Crockett interrupted firmly, her voice carrying an authority that cut through Scott's attempt to redirect the conversation. The three words hung in the air like a challenge. Scott's mouth opened slightly, then closed. He wasn't accustomed to being interrupted, especially not by a second-term representative. Crockett continued without missing a beat. "What's not public record, Senator, is this series of emails between you and Kash Patel regarding the Meridian contract. Emails that were sent using the W Staffline server, which I believe was created specifically to avoid official congressional oversight." She held up a printed document, and every camera in the room zoomed in on the official letterhead visible at the top of the page. Scott's face went pale. The confidence that had carried him into the hearing began to evaporate as he realized that Crockett wasn't just making accusations, she had documentation. "I don't know what you think you have there," Scott said, his voice losing its earlier authority. "But I can assure you that any communications regarding defense matters have been entirely appropriate and—" "Let me read from one of these emails," Crockett interrupted again. "This is from you to Patel, dated March 15th of last year. The Meridian deal needs to go through without committee review. Can you handle the paperwork on your end? Scott knows this will be worth our while when the campaign bills come due." The hearing room erupted. Republican committee members shouted objections, while Democrats demanded to see the documents. Gallery spectators leaned forward, trying to catch every word. Camera operators scrambled to capture the chaos. But through it all, Crockett remained calm, her papers organized in front of her, waiting for the commotion to die down so she could continue. Scott looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on quicksand. His hands gripped the edge of the witness table as he tried to process how this routine hearing had turned into a nightmare. "Mr. Chairman," Scott called out desperately, "I request an immediate recess to review these alleged documents and determine their authenticity." Chairman Dupont, recognizing that the hearing had spiraled beyond his control, reluctantly called for a 15-minute recess. As soon as the gavel fell, Scott shot up from his seat. He didn't wait for his lawyer, didn't wait for the cameras to cut. He yanked his microphone off his lapel and stormed toward the back consultation room used for witness conferences. His attorney followed, whispering sharply, while cameras caught just a glimpse of Scott's face as he passed behind the chairman's desk, tense, red, and shaken. Inside the private consultation room, the door clicked shut with no audio or cameras recording. But according to two aides standing just outside, Scott's voice was loud enough to cut through the walls. "What the hell's going on out there?" he snapped. "How did she even get those emails? They weren't supposed to be on any official record. They were buried. I know they were buried." His attorney didn't answer immediately. He flipped open his laptop and pulled up an internal server access log, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "Someone gave them to her," the lawyer said finally, tapping a line of code on his screen. "This isn't something she could have found through normal congressional channels. This came from someone with high-level access to the Intelligence Committee servers." "Do you think Devlin flipped?" Scott asked, referring to Rob Devlin, the Intelligence Committee staffer who had helped facilitate the original Meridian arrangement. "I think it doesn't matter right now," his attorney replied. "What matters is that you need to shut this down before she brings out whatever else she has. Because if she has the emails, there's no telling what other documentation she might have." Back in the hearing room, Crockett remained seated while chaos erupted around her. She hadn't looked at her phone once, maintaining the focused composure that had served her well during her prosecutorial career. Her chief of staff, Brenda Williams, leaned close. "That definitely got him rattled," she whispered. Crockett nodded slightly. "He's hiding something bigger than just the Meridian contract. You don't panic like that over one defense deal." Across the chamber, Republican staffers huddled in worried conversations, while Democratic members demanded to see the documents Crockett had referenced. The hearing wasn't even halfway through, and already every major political reporter in the building was filing breaking news alerts. The hashtag # Scott Crockett began trending on Twitter within minutes. News anchors scrambled to get legal experts on air to analyze the implications. TikTok users posted dramatic clips with freeze frames of Scott's stunned reaction, adding captions like, "When you realize you've been caught," and "the moment his career ended." 15 minutes later, the committee reconvened. Scott walked back in slower than before, looking like someone who had just emerged from a very difficult conversation. The swagger was gone, replaced by the careful movements of a man who now understood he was in serious trouble. Crockett barely looked up as he took his seat. "Senator Scott," she began, "let's return to your earlier comments about evidence-based governance. You mentioned that accusations should be supported by proper documentation. I agree completely." She reached into her folder and pulled out another set of papers. "This is a reply from Rob Devlin, sent 2 hours after receiving your email about the Meridian contract. Would you like me to read his response?" Scott's hands were visibly shaking now. "Representative Crockett, I don't know where you obtained these alleged documents, but I categorically deny any wrongdoing in my official duties regarding defense contracting or..." Mr. Devlin's reply reads, "Senator, I can expedite the Meridian approval through the Emergency Provisions Clause. The committee won't see the details until after implementation. Patel has agreed to handle the intelligence side. Your speaking fee for the defense contractor conference should cover any immediate political costs." The second bombshell hit even harder than the first. Speaking fees from defense contractors while simultaneously expediting their contracts was exactly the kind of corruption that ended political careers. Republican committee members looked stricken. Several began checking their phones, undoubtedly fielding calls from party leadership, demanding to know how this had happened and how it could be contained. But Crockett wasn't finished. "Senator, this brings us to the most troubling document in this series, an audio file that was recorded during a conference call between you, Patel, and representatives from Meridian Defense." She held up a small digital recording device. "Would you like me to play the relevant portion for the committee?" Scott's face went from red to ashen gray. An audio recording meant there would be no room for interpretation, no way to claim documents were taken out of context or misunderstood. "This is a kangaroo court," Scott finally exploded, his composure completely shattered. "These documents are clearly fabricated. This is a partisan witch hunt designed to damage my reputation before the next election cycle." But his protest sounded desperate rather than indignant. Everyone in the room could see that this was the response of a man who had been caught, not the righteous anger of someone falsely accused. Crockett remained unflappable. "Senator, these documents have been authenticated by 3 independent cybersecurity firms. The metadata confirms their origin from official congressional servers. If you'd like to question their authenticity, I'm happy to provide the technical verification reports." She paused, letting the weight of that statement sink in before delivering her final blow. "But what I find most interesting is that you haven't actually denied the content of these communications. You've questioned their source and their authenticity, but you haven't said that you didn't write these emails or participate in these conversations." The silence that followed was deafening. Scott sat motionless, trapped by his own failure to issue a clear denial. Any denial at this point would sound hollow, but continuing to avoid the question made him look even more guilty. Chairman Dupont, recognizing that the hearing had become a political disaster for his party, attempted damage control. "I think we should postpone further discussion of these allegations until the proper authorities can—" "Mr. Chairman," Crockett interrupted politely but firmly, "with respect, we're the proper authorities. Congressional oversight of defense contracting is exactly what this committee was created to do." She turned her attention back to Scott, who looked like he was searching for an exit that didn't exist. "Senator, you came to this hearing questioning my qualifications and experience. You suggested that I lack the judgment necessary for serious governance, but the evidence suggests that it's your judgment that should concern the American people." The cameras captured every moment of Scott's visible collapse. His earlier confidence had been replaced by the deer-in-headlights expression of someone who realized he had walked into a trap entirely of his own making. "The Meridian contract you helped expedite was worth $2.3 billion. The speaking fees you received from defense contractors over the past 3 years total $340,000. And according to these emails, you explicitly connected your assistance with their contracts to your own political fundraising." Each number hit like a physical blow. Scott slumped further in his chair with every revelation, his political career crumbling in real time on national television. But Crockett saved the most devastating revelation for last. "What makes this particularly concerning, Senator, is that the Meridian contract you helped expedite was for defensive systems that independent testing showed were defective. Systems that put American service members at risk because proper oversight was bypassed for political convenience." The final sentence transformed the hearing from a political scandal into a matter of national security and military safety. Scott wasn't just accused of corruption, he was accused of endangering American troops for personal financial gain. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. Scott's communications director, watching from the gallery, was already fielding calls from major newspapers and television networks demanding comment. Republican leadership was scrambling to distance themselves from what was rapidly becoming a party-wide disaster. Social media exploded with clips from the hearing. Scott corruption joined Scott Crockett as trending topics. The phrase, "I'm not finished," which Crockett had used to silence Scott's interruption, became an instant meme, symbolizing the moment when preparation defeated position. Within hours of the hearing's conclusion, Scott's office issued a terse statement saying that the senator regretted that the discussion became personal and that he respected Representative Crockett's passion for her constituents. But the damage was already done. That evening, Scott appeared on Fox News trying to reframe the exchange as an example of Democratic hostility and inability to have civil discourse. The interview was widely panned, with critics noting that Scott seemed defensive and unprepared for questions about his own documented communications. Several conservative commentators who had initially supported Scott's attack on Crockett began distancing themselves once they saw how thoroughly she had dismantled his defense. One prominent Republican strategist, speaking anonymously to Politico, said, "Tim stepped in it big time. You can't attack someone's qualifications if you haven't done your homework on what they've actually accomplished and what they might know about you." The revelation that Crockett had access to internal congressional communications raised immediate questions about how she had obtained them. The answer came 3 days later when Melinda Cash, the basement archive worker, agreed to an interview with the Washington Post. "I've worked in government for 8 years, Cash told the reporter. "I believe in public service and transparency. When I discovered evidence of corruption, I had a choice: stay silent and be complicit, or make sure the right people saw what I had found." Cash's decision to go public transformed her from anonymous whistleblower to national figure overnight. Her methodical investigation and courage in exposing wrongdoing earned praise from government ethics organizations and inspired other federal employees to speak out about corruption they had witnessed. For Tim Scott, the hearing marked the beginning of the end of his political ambitions. His presidential aspirations, which were already on life support after his failed 2024 campaign, were dealt a fatal blow. Political insiders noted that the exchange had revealed Scott as someone who could be easily outmaneuvered by a second-term representative, raising serious questions about his effectiveness as a national leader. Scott's poll numbers in South Carolina, while still relatively strong, showed their first significant decline in years. More importantly, his influence within the Republican Party noticeably diminished. He was quietly removed from several high-profile speaking engagements, and rumors circulated that party leadership was losing confidence in his ability to effectively communicate their message without creating additional scandals. For Jasmine Crockett, the hearing was a career-defining moment that established her as a major figure in Democratic politics. Her office reported receiving over 10,000 supportive emails in the 24 hours after the exchange, including dozens from fellow members of Congress. Nancy Pelosi tweeted her support. Jasmine Crockett represents the best of the new generation of Democratic leaders, prepared, principled, and unafraid to speak truth to power. Fundraising emails featuring clips from the exchange raised over $500,000 for Democratic candidates in just 2 days. The Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee immediately began featuring Crockett in their promotional materials, recognizing that she had become a powerful draw for donors and volunteers. Speaking invitations poured in from across the country. Within a week, Crockett had been invited to speak at over 30 events, from college campuses to Democratic Party fundraisers. Her team had to hire additional staff just to handle the media requests. The exchange between Scott and Crockett highlighted several broader trends in American politics that went far beyond these two individuals. First, it demonstrated the growing confidence and skill of the new generation of progressive Democrats. Crockett's response showed that younger Democrats were no longer content to simply absorb Republican attacks. They were prepared to hit back hard and effectively. Second, it exposed the limitations of the Republican Party's strategy of elevating black conservatives like Scott as shields against charges of racism. When Scott attacked Crockett, he couldn't hide behind his identity. She was equally black, equally qualified, and far better prepared for the exchange. Third, it showed how social media had fundamentally changed political communication. Crockett's ability to use digital platforms effectively wasn't a liability, as Scott had suggested. It was a superpower that allowed her to reach and mobilize people in ways that traditional politicians couldn't match. Political scientists immediately began analyzing the exchange as an example of how political discourse was evolving. Dr. Melanie Price, a professor at Prairie View A&M University, noted, "What we saw was a clash between old-school political tactics and new-school political communication." Crockett understood that in the social media age, authenticity and preparation matter more than seniority and politeness. The story of Tim Scott's attack on Jasmine Crockett and her devastating response became a case study in political preparation and strategic thinking. Law schools began using the exchange to teach students about the importance of thorough research and evidence-based arguments. But perhaps most importantly, the hearing demonstrated that in modern American politics, information is power, and that power can come from the most unexpected places. Melinda Cash's quiet work in a basement archive had ultimately brought down a sitting senator and elevated a rising star. 6 months later, as congressional ethics investigators continued their work on the Meridian contract scandal, Jasmine Crockett reflected on the hearing during an interview with CNN's Anderson Cooper. "I didn't go into that hearing planning to end anyone's career," she said. "I went in prepared to do my job, which is oversight of government operations and accountability for public officials." Senator Scott chose to make it personal, but the documents spoke for themselves. When Cooper asked what advice she would give to other young politicians facing attacks from more experienced opponents, Crockett's answer was simple. Preparation beats position every single time. When someone comes for you, make sure you've done your homework first, because if you haven't, you might just get the education of a lifetime on live television. The Tim Scott-Jasmine Crockett hearing would be remembered as the moment when a rising star definitively announced her arrival on the national stage, while a presumed presidential contender saw his ambitions crumble in real time. It proved that in politics, as in life, underestimating your opponent can be a fatal mistake. 2 weeks after the congressional hearing that ended Tim Scott's presidential ambitions, something even more explosive was brewing beneath the surface of Washington politics. The initial scandal had focused on the Meridian defense contract, but Jasmine Crockett's investigation was far from over. What she had revealed in that hearing room was merely the tip of an iceberg that threatened to sink multiple political careers. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Rob Devlin himself. The Intelligence Committee staffer who had been Patel's primary accomplice in the contracting scheme was sitting in a downtown D.C. coffee shop when he made the decision that would transform him from conspirator to key witness. His hands shook as he dialed the number for Crockett's chief of staff, Brenda Williams. "I need to talk to Representative Crockett," Devlin said without preamble when Brenda answered. "I have information about Senator Scott that goes far beyond what came out in the hearing, but I need guarantees about protection and immunity before I say anything more." Brenda, recognizing the significance of the call, immediately patched in Marcus Chen, Crockett's legal counsel and former federal prosecutor. Within an hour, they had arranged a secure meeting at an undisclosed location in Virginia, away from the prying eyes of Capitol Hill. Devlin arrived at the designated safe house looking like a man who hadn't slept in days. His usually meticulous appearance was disheveled, his tie askew, his eyes darting nervously as he explained the full scope of what he had discovered. "The Meridian contract was just one piece of a much larger operation," Devlin began, his voice barely above a whisper, despite the secure location. "Scott has been running what amounts to a congressional influence peddling ring for the past 3 years. Defense contractors, pharmaceutical companies, energy firms, they all pay into a system where Scott guarantees favorable treatment in exchange for speaking fees, campaign contributions, and post-Senate job promises." Jasmine leaned forward, her prosecutorial instincts engaged. "How many contracts are we talking about?" 17 major deals worth a combined $47 billion, Devlin replied, producing a USB drive from his jacket pocket. Every transaction was coordinated through the W staff line server system that Melinda Cash discovered. Scott would identify upcoming contract opportunities, reach out to preferred vendors, and then use his influence to ensure they received favorable treatment. The scope of the corruption was staggering. What had seemed like a single instance of pay-to-play politics was actually a systematic operation that had been influencing billions of dollars in government contracts. "But here's the part that will destroy him completely," Devlin continued, his voice gaining strength as he realized he was finally telling the truth after months of complicity. "Scott has been coordinating with foreign entities. 3 of the major contracts went to companies with significant Chinese ownership stakes. He's been essentially selling American defense technology to foreign governments through these backdoor arrangements." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Corruption was one thing, but potential treason was entirely different. If Devlin's allegations were accurate, Scott hadn't just been lining his pockets, he had been compromising national security. Jasmine's legal team spent the next 72 hours verifying every piece of information Devlin provided. The documentation was extensive and damning. Bank records showing suspicious transfers, encrypted communications with foreign nationals, and detailed records of contract modifications that favored companies with questionable loyalties. Meanwhile, the fallout from the original hearing continued to expand. Scott's attempt to weather the initial storm had failed spectacularly. His Fox News interview had been such a disaster that the network quietly canceled his upcoming appearances. Conservative talk radio hosts who had once championed him began expressing doubts about his judgment and leadership capabilities. The South Carolina Republican Party, sensing political disaster, began quietly recruiting primary challengers for Scott's next Senate race. Donors who had pledged support for his presidential ambitions started requesting refunds. His once loyal staff began updating their resumes and reaching out to other campaigns. But Scott's troubles were about to get exponentially worse. On a Thursday morning, exactly 3 weeks after the hearing, Jasmine Crockett called a press conference at the Capitol. The assembled media expected routine follow-up on the Meridian contract investigation. Instead, they witnessed the political equivalent of a nuclear detonation. 3 weeks ago, this chamber witnessed Senator Tim Scott's attempts to discredit congressional oversight through personal attacks. Crockett began, standing behind a podium loaded with documents and flanked by her legal team. Today, I'm here to present evidence that Senator Scott's corruption extends far beyond a single defense contract to what appears to be systematic compromise of American national security. The press corps, sensing a major story, fell completely silent. Camera operators scrambled to ensure they were capturing every moment. Over the past 18 months, Senator Scott has used his position on the Armed Services Committee to influence $47 billion worth of government contracts. In exchange, he has received $1.2 million in speaking fees, campaign contributions, and other financial considerations from the companies that benefited from his intervention. Gasps rippled through the assembled reporters. The numbers were staggering, far exceeding anything that had been revealed in the original hearing. But more troubling, Crockett continued, is evidence that 3 of these contracts, worth a combined $8.3 billion, went to companies with significant ownership stakes held by entities controlled by the Chinese government. The bombshell hit with devastating force. Foreign influence and potential national security compromises transformed Scott's scandal from corruption to potential treason. These contracts involved advanced radar systems, encrypted communication technology, and missile guidance components. Senator Scott's intervention ensured that American military technology was essentially sold to foreign adversaries through these corrupted procurement processes. Crockett paused, allowing the gravity of the accusations to sink in before delivering her most devastating revelation. We have bank records showing that Senator Scott received personal payments totaling $340,000 from shell companies that trace back to foreign nationals. We have encrypted communications showing his direct coordination with representatives of these foreign-controlled entities. And we have testimony from a cooperating witness who was directly involved in facilitating these transactions. The press conference exploded into chaos. Reporters shouted questions, camera flashes strobed continuously, and assignment editors called their newsrooms with breaking news alerts. This was no longer just a political scandal. It was a potential national security crisis. Within hours, the FBI announced they were opening a formal investigation into Scott's activities. The Senate Ethics Committee, which had been moving slowly on the original Meridian allegations, suddenly accelerated their timeline and expanded their inquiry. Republican leadership, recognizing the existential threat to their party, began privately pressuring Scott to resign. Scott's response was predictably defiant but increasingly desperate. In a hastily arranged press conference outside his Capitol Hill office, he denounced the new allegations as a coordinated attack by radical Democrats and deep state operatives determined to destroy any black conservative who threatens their narrative. But his defiance rang hollow. The evidence was too extensive, too well documented, and too serious to dismiss as partisan persecution. Even his most loyal supporters began to distance themselves as the national security implications became clear. The political earthquake continued to expand. The Pentagon announced it was reviewing all contracts that had been influenced by Scott's interventions. The Department of Justice opened parallel investigations into potential violations of foreign agent registration laws. Intelligence agencies began assessing whether classified information had been compromised through the tainted contracts. International allies expressed concern about the security of shared intelligence and technology. NATO partners quietly began reviewing their own contracts with the companies that had benefited from Scott's corruption. The scandal was threatening America's credibility with its closest allies, at a time when international cooperation was crucial. For Jasmine Crockett, the expanding investigation represented both vindication and enormous responsibility. She had uncovered what appeared to be one of the most serious congressional corruption cases in modern American history. But she also knew that the implications extended far beyond any individual politician. "This isn't about partisan politics," she told CNN's Anderson Cooper during a primetime interview. "This is about the integrity of our national defense and the security of our country. When elected officials sell their influence to foreign adversaries, they're not just betraying their oath of office, they're betraying every American who trusts them to protect our nation." The interview, watched by over 12 million viewers, cemented Crockett's reputation as the politician who had exposed the scandal and her commitment to following the evidence wherever it led, regardless of political consequences. Behind the scenes, federal investigators were building what prosecutors described as an airtight case against Scott. The cooperation of Rob Devlin, combined with the documentation provided by Melinda Cash and additional evidence gathered through subpoenas, created a comprehensive picture of systematic corruption that would be nearly impossible to defend against. Legal experts began speculating about potential charges ranging from bribery and conspiracy to violations of the Foreign Agents Registration Act. Some suggested that if prosecutors could prove Scott knowingly compromised national security, he could face charges related to espionage or treason. The political ramifications extended beyond Scott himself. Several other Republicans who had benefited from the contracted company's campaign contributions found themselves under scrutiny. Lobbyists who had facilitated the arrangements faced their own legal jeopardy. The entire system of congressional influence over defense contracting was being examined and reformed. 6 months after Jasmine Crockett's initial hearing confrontation with Tim Scott, the senator announced his resignation from the United States Senate. In a bitter farewell speech delivered to a nearly empty chamber, Scott maintained his innocence but acknowledged that continuing to serve while under investigation would not serve the interests of South Carolina or the Republican Party. His resignation speech was widely panned as self-serving and unrepentant. Rather than accepting responsibility for his actions, Scott blamed the media, the Justice Department, and partisan enemies for his downfall. The tone-deaf response further damaged his already destroyed reputation and eliminated any possibility of political rehabilitation. The final chapter of the Scott scandal came 9 months later, when he pleaded guilty to conspiracy charges in federal court. As part of his plea agreement, he admitted to accepting bribes, facilitating contracts for foreign-controlled entities, and compromising national security for personal financial gain. The judge, in accepting the plea, noted that Scott's crimes represented a profound betrayal of the public trust and a serious threat to national security. Scott was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, effectively ending any possibility of future political involvement. For Jasmine Crockett, Scott's downfall represented the successful conclusion of the most significant investigation of her congressional career. But more importantly, it demonstrated the power of thorough preparation, principled oversight, and the courage to confront corruption regardless of the political risks involved. The Tim Scott scandal became a watershed moment in congressional ethics enforcement, leading to new regulations on foreign influence, enhanced oversight of defense contracting, and stronger penalties for corruption. Most significantly, it showed that even the most powerful politicians could be held accountable when dedicated public servants like Melinda Cash, Rob Devlin, and Jasmine Crockett were willing to put truth above politics and country above party. 5 years after the congressional hearing that destroyed Tim Scott's career, the impact of that explosive confrontation continued to reverberate through American politics in unprecedented ways. The Crockett Standard had become institutionalized across federal government. Named after Jasmine's thorough preparation and evidence-based approach, it was now required protocol for all congressional oversight hearings. No longer could legislators make accusations without documentation or defend themselves with empty rhetoric when faced with hard evidence. Melinda Cash, the basement archivist whose quiet investigation started it all, now served as Director of Congressional Transparency for the Government Accountability Office. Her role involved training federal employees to recognize and report potential corruption, ensuring future scandals would be caught before compromising national security. I never imagined that overhearing a conversation about a ghost drive would lead to reforming congressional oversight, Cash reflected during a Harvard Kennedy School symposium. But it taught me that ordinary people can change history when they choose courage over comfort. Rob Devlin, whose cooperation had been crucial in building the case against Scott, now worked as a consultant helping potential whistleblowers navigate the complex process of exposing governmental corruption while protecting themselves legally. The Scott scandal had triggered comprehensive reform of defense contracting procedures. Foreign ownership disclosure requirements were strengthened, congressional influence over contract awards was limited, and an independent oversight board was established to monitor conflicts of interest. Tim Scott himself had served 6 years before being released on parole. His memoir, Betrayed by the System, met with universal criticism and poor sales. Publishers had largely blacklisted him from further book deals or speaking engagements. For Jasmine Crockett, the Scott confrontation had launched a remarkable political trajectory. After 4 House terms, she was elected to the U.S. Senate in a landslide victory demonstrating her cross-party appeal. Her reputation for preparation and fearless oversight made her one of Washington's most respected voices. During Senate confirmation hearings, "Were you prepared for the Crockett Standard?" became a running joke among political insiders. Nominees knew they needed impeccable documentation and airtight defenses for potential conflicts. The most lasting legacy was demonstrating that in the social media age, political corruption could no longer hide in congressional back rooms. The combination of dedicated civil servants, fearless legislators, and transparent documentation had created a new accountability paradigm. On the 5th anniversary, CNN's Anderson Cooper invited Jasmine back to discuss the hearing's lasting impact. When asked what she hoped people would remember, her answer focused characteristically on broader implications rather than personal recognition. "I hope people remember that democracy only works when ordinary citizens, whether congresswomen, basement archivists, or intelligence staffers, are willing to put truth above politics and country above career," she said. Tim Scott's downfall wasn't about one corrupt senator. It was about proving no one is above the law when good people hold them accountable. The hearing room now featured a small plaque commemorating the Crockett Standard, serving as a daily reminder that preparation, evidence, and courage would always triumph over position, privilege, and corruption. That truth, tested in live television and vindicated by events, had become the cornerstone of more accountable government. If this story of preparation triumphing over position inspired you, don't let it end here. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible moments where courage and competence defeated corruption and arrogance. Hit that notification bell, because in American politics, the most important battles happen when truth confronts power. Share your thoughts in the comments. What other political moments showed that preparation beats position? Your engagement helps us bring you more stories that matter. The future of democracy depends on holding our leaders accountable, and that starts with staying informed and staying engaged.